Hi, good morning, Facebook. Ryan Bowl here, senior Middle East and North Africa analyst, with Carmen Colosi, one of our Latin America analysts. And today we're talking about Chile's recent rejection of a constitutional reform, the trajectory of Chile going forward. Carmen, why don't you start us off with, like, at the top? What are the headline notes? What was the constitutional reform about, and why did it fail?
Sure. So the constitutional reform was a document that was drafted over the course of the past year. It was essentially an entire rewrite of Chile's constitution. The reform was initially kind of lobbied for back in 2019 when there was a large protest movement in Chile. The protesters were really looking for a lot of social reforms. They were looking to change things like the pension system, the healthcare system, but they were not looking for a large kind of systemic change in Chile. And what the drafters of the Constitution did is they went and kind of looked at these large systemic changes. So, for example, getting rid of the country's Senate and things like that. And part of that is that we saw Chileans really kind of move against the reform in the months leading up to the vote. And the vote was really an overwhelming rejection of the constitutional rewrite.
Right. So they said we want reform, but then they were like, no, not like that. Once they saw the actual constitution. Okay. And I understand. So Chile's obviously got a history of being pro-business. It was also, under the Pinochet regime where it was, ardently capitalist and everything, and that kind of that pushback. What is the legacy of that? How did that impact this constitutional process?
Definitely, and it continues to impact the constitutional process. So, because the current constitution was drafted under the regime of Pinochet, that's something that we have really seen kind of drive a lot of interest to change the constitution, and we really see a lot of Chileans continue to lobby for constitutional changes. A majority of Chileans are in favor of changing the constitution to a different constitution, just not the constitution that was drafted. And they're still in favor of drafting a new constitution, mainly in part because of this kind of dictatorship history that the current constitution has.
So does this have any, impacts beyond Chile? Brazil's got its election coming up, and that's a battle between kind of left and right. And Argentina's economy is always making political instability there in the headlines. So are the dynamics within Chile, are they playing out throughout the region? Do they have an impact on the rest of the region?
So the dynamics in Chile, every country in Latin America is relatively insulated. However, when you look at social movements throughout the different areas of Latin America, specifically South America, you do see a lot of fuel. So when you see things like this happening in Chile, and a lot of protest movement and things around social rights and things like that, you can see kind of some overlap between activists and protesters looking at tactics that Chileans are using and looking at what Chileans are advocating for, and using that not just in places like Argentina and Brazil, but also in places like Colombia and Peru as well.
Right. And I'm wondering a little bit about the wider, global dynamics of this. Obviously, Augusto Pinochet was put in, he was able to accomplish his coup in part because there were Cold War dynamics. The United States was worried that they were going to lose Chile to another Cuba-style government. Now, we don't have a Cold War anymore, but we do have a competition between the United States and China. And China obviously looks to Chile for things like lithium and copper, things that are critical for their technology sector and part of that tech race between the U.S. So if Chile moves to become a little bit less pro-business, if the next constitutional reform is still in the same vein and manages to squeeze through and gets rid of some of that pro-corporate Pinochet legacy, what does that mean for China? What does that mean for the United States in their relationships both with Chile and with each other?
So Ryan, you're really getting at the heart of the main question around this new constitutional rewrite, whatever form that may take, is that, when looking at Chile and Chile's copper sector and Chile's lithium sector, both of which are used heavily in China and the United States for construction and housing and things like that, green energy sector and things like that. So that is really going to be the next question. So a lot of the contracts that are currently in place for the copper and the lithium sectors, they're already kind of grandfathered in. So it's going to be very difficult to go in and retroactively change those contracts. What we're looking at is for the future. So looking, out, what is the kind of contractual model going to be in Chile? Currently, there's a kind of concessionary model that cannot be revoked. So that's something that can be changed by the new constitution. And a lot of people that are in these spaces are really going to be looking at this new constitutional draft as, will this change Chile's current concessionary model? And if it does, then we could potentially see investors in places like China and the United States starting to move away from Chile for things like copper and towards other countries such as, neighboring Peru. And for lithium, we could see investors move towards potentially Australia or maybe even into Argentina, depending on if the regulatory environment improves there.
Do you think there's any chance of like external interference with Chilean politics? The U.S. president weighing in, the Chinese weighing in. Is there anything like that that could play out within Chile?
So Chile has always kind of walked a very interesting tightrope when it comes to the U.S. and China. Historically, the country has very close ties with both. And has been able to kind of cater to a certain sector of the Chinese market and a certain sector of the US market. And so because of that, there's not really this kind of, large influence, at least rhetorically, from China and the US really trying to push Chile one way or the other, the way that you do see that in other countries such as Ecuador. But when it comes to this, where you're going to see that kind of competition really play out is when is really looking into those contracts for copper specifically, because that's one of Chile's main exports. And that's where you see China really kind of overtook the United States as the main copper destination for Chilean copper. And so these kind of really kind of niche sectors such as copper and lithium is where you're going to see this play out. You're not going to see this play out on the diplomatic stage.
Right. And I think that's important to note of how different things are between now and even, the 1980s and 1970s. Chile has a certain level of geopolitical freedom to develop itself within its own model. That's still tricky, though, isn't it? Because they're trying to strike that balance of they still obviously need investment. They need corporations. That's part of life there. But at the same time, like many countries, there's a question of the social safety net and whether or not it's strong enough for the public. With all of these rapid changes, it's a fascinating thing to discuss and to monitor. And I know you'll be keeping an eye on Chile's developments for us, as well as, of course, Brazil and Argentina are other regional heavyweights as their own political developments go forward. I'm not sure if we've got any questions or comments at this time. So let's just give folks a second if there's anybody who'd like to ask us anything specific, anything wider related to this issue, tangential. Now's your chance. And if not, if there's I don't think I see anybody. Here we go. A couple of questions. Okay, so why is the public rebel against the radical option? So maybe we can delve a little bit deeper into that. Why didn't they go for this?
Yeah, so this is super interesting. A lot of Chileans, when they were pushing for the kind of more structural changes back in 2019, they were looking for changes. A lot of people were, very single issue voters. So a lot of them said, oh, we're interested in having a pension reform. Oh, we're interested in having healthcare reform. We're interested in having, something that is going to help them in their day-to-day lives. Now, when it came to the constitutional rewrite that we just saw be very strongly rejected, that's something that a lot of people saw, okay, maybe there is this one issue that I'm interested in, but on these other 10 or several issues, they're not so keen on what the rewrite had to say. So a lot of what the constitutional rewrite was a very kind of structural change in Chile, and a lot of people didn't really want these kind of broader structural changes. They wanted a little bit more. They wanted to change the social environment. They wanted increased state support, but they didn't really want to change the country's economic or political models as a whole. And so what we're very likely to see in this next constitutional rewrite is exactly that. We're likely to see the constituents, or however they play this out, really focus on reforms that are a little bit more towards the social sector and a little bit less towards these broader structural changes.
I think one of those structural changes that struck with me, you said they were planning on getting rid of the Senate. That was one of the
Yes.
what was the thinking behind that? What would have impact have that what would have happened if they had done that?
Yeah, so the Senate in Chile has been traditionally a very kind of conservative body.
Mhm.
The impact was that you would have seen the House take on a lot more responsibilities, and the Senate would have been a chamber of regions, and that chamber of regions would have been consulted for things like the budget and if there were any constitutional amendments, but they would not have as much play when it comes to just regular legislation. And so that is the really big difference, that it would have made it would have made it a lot easier for Chile to implement these more leftist legislation, whereas currently the Senate is able to kind of block a lot of leftist legislation.
And it's interesting to think about. A lot of people, in not just Chile, but globally, they talk
Yeah,
about how institutions like the Senate here in the U.S. and within other countries as well, the Senate tends to be a little bit slower moving. It tends to be a little more conservative, and
exactly.
people want to get rid of these institutions, or at least there's very loud voices that want to. And then when you actually ask the public if they really would like to get rid of them and kind of give your system over to more populist institutions like a house or a legislature that's proportionally elected, people often balk at that.
Yeah,
And it's interesting to, I mean, some places are very democratic and proportional, like Israel, and the result is that their
interesting.
Knesset doesn't work. They don't get,
Yes.
they're having endless elections because their society is divided. And in some cases, people prefer, to have these conservative institutions to smooth things along.
Yeah, Ryan, that's such an interesting comparison. When you are looking at Israel, do you see any sort of efforts to change the Knesset at all, in the structure of the Knesset, or is that just accepted into Israeli life? I know we're a little bit tangential here, but I'm
Right,
interested.
but yeah, it is. It's surprising that that actually hasn't come up in the
Hmm.
Israeli context. That they haven't done a bigger talk about structural change. They seem to just kind of accept that this is the cost of doing politics in the country, is to have an
Okay.
election every 6 months to 2 years.
Yeah.
And but yeah, like one of our commenters saying that it shows the Chilean public is deeply divided, and I think that is a global issue. We have so much change caused by globalization, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, this upending geopolitics, and not everybody. The idea of a consensus. I'm not sure if there's a country out there that has found a. There's forced consensus. There's like China. They force you into a
Sure.
consensus. But I don't know if there's a country out there right now that has a democratic consensus and is going forward, with that sort of unity. And I think Chile is another example of that.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting because when you look at Chile, you see a majority are interested in changing the current constitution. But again, there's a lot of division as to what those changes might look like. You definitely have a very radical left. You have a very, a kind of increasingly further right emerging. And so it's interesting that there's some areas where there's consensus, but there's others that it's very divided.
Yeah. Um, Oh, does this mean that somebody is asking, does this mean the resurgence of right-wing politics? Is this going to give an opportunity for the right to kind of come back?
That's a great question. We've definitely seen a resurgence of the right in the previous election. So the election of November 2021, we saw a right wing candidate kind of come out of the blue, Cast, and Cast really kind of represented a very far right element in Chile that we've not really seen before. So Cast was very much against immigration and very much against, this kind of like leftist model of increased social welfare spending. But really in Chile, that's not kind of moving towards, I see the question here is, will we see Pinochet loyalists come back up? That's not really moving towards the previous dictator. A lot of this is kind of a new, very kind of populist right that is very nationalist, but it's not in that same kind of dictatorial sense of wanting to take control in that same way. So yeah.
Right. And then, but of course, if they can't get a constitution going, if it ends up with paralysis, that does give your radicals on either side. And you've written about this. Some Chilean left-wing activists will be doing strikes and protests and
Likely,
disruptive
yeah.
activity as they try to keep the temperature up for these reforms, because that I guess is one of the less likely but still high impact risks of kind of radicalization on the fringes, and that's what happens when political systems can't deliver.
Yeah, exactly. And it's notable that even if they're not able to implement a constitutional rewrite, say in a year or something, if a new constitutional rewrite is rejected or something like that, it's notable that we will likely still see significant changes to the Constitution just through constitutional amendments, not through rewriting the whole thing.
Right. Okay, well, that's about our 15 minutes. That's about how long we normally go on these. Thank you so much for those great questions from some of our viewers. Carmen, this is great discussions, a lot of interesting things. And if anybody's interested, subscribe to RANE Worldview at ranenetwork.com, RANE network.com, and you can see some of our subscription options there. Carmen, thanks so much for joining me.